Hey everyone, this is Mr. Burns. Good afternoon to you all. Hope that you're keeping safe during these difficult times. We're going to take another look at the Compromise of 1850. And what we see here is a portrait of President Zachary Taylor. He had fallen deathly ill after a 4th of July celebration in the summer of 1850. And he was kind of an obstacle to the Compromise of 1850. If you remember, the Compromise of 1850 gets rolling when gold is discovered in California. And in 1849, you have thousands and thousands of people that went to California. And now California wants in as a free state. You would normally you wouldn't think another state coming in is a big deal, but in 1850, California came in. Now the Senate is going to have an unequal balance between slave states and free states, and the free states will control the United States Senate. So in this picture here we see Henry Clay, a famed American politician ever since like the War of 1812. He comes back from retirement. He had returned home to Kentucky, his home state, and he comes back because he feels like the nation needs him, and he meets with fellow senators, and they come up with a plan for keeping the nation together and minimizing the crisis at hand. So some of the ideas that Henry Clay and his fellow senators had come up with is that California is going to come in as a free state. They're going to pass a strong fugitive slave law to make southern states happy. Slave trade is going to end in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, but you would still be free to own slaves there and bring your slaves to the nation's capital. And then they're going to punt on the issue of land taken from Mexico. So they're going to allow the people of the territories to decide whether they would be a slave state or a free state at the time that they applied for statehood. This idea was called popular sovereignty. Try as he might, Henry Clay is never able to get those pieces of the Compromise of 1850 passed. That bill keeps failing time after time again when they bring it up before a vote in the Senate. Let's talk about another aged senator in 1850, and this is kind of John C. Calhoun's swan song too. He was even in a rougher shape than Henry Clay. He is a sick and dying man in 1850. In the portrait of Calhoun on the right, you see him seated, and that's because he was too sick to even get up and talk to his fellow senators. So the man with all the papers is reading Calhoun's speech. Calhoun had been in the Senate since the early 1830s, and he was the chief defender of slavery. He was probably a very effective senator because from 1830 to 1850, there are no laws proposed or even getting close to passing that would regulate slavery or threaten to abolish slavery in the United States. So this is his last appearances in the Senate, and he's a lot like Taylor. He's like, there can't be any compromise on this. So what Calhoun was saying is, you got to give the South what they want. He's opposed to compromise of any kind, and he wants the South protected, and he wants slavery protected. And really the only way you can give these ironclad protections is to amend the Constitution. So his position was really radical. It did not have any chance whatsoever of passing. We put him in there just to show you how strong the tempers were and really how close the country was coming to war in that summer of 1850 as the nation fought over the admission of California. So what we have happen is we have some new leadership that comes into play. Probably the most important is the man on this screen. That's a picture of Stephen A. Douglas. And Douglas is a new senator from Illinois. He takes Clay's legislation and he builds coalitions for the pieces of it. So his approach is different from Henry Clay. Henry Clay had put everything together in one bill, and he tried many times to get it passed, and it always failed. Stephen A. Douglas takes the little pieces and gets just enough votes in the Senate to get each piece passed. And then the other change in the leadership was Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore had become the new president when Zachary Taylor passed away. Millard Fillmore was much more open to compromise than President Taylor was. So as Douglas gets the pieces of the Compromise of 1850 passed, Millard Fillmore was very happy to put his signature to it. So again, some of those pieces. California is coming in as a free state. Slavery is still going to remain legal in the District of Columbia, but the slave trade was ended there. So you couldn't walk down the streets of Washington, D.C. and see a slave market anymore, where human beings were put on a scaffold and then sold to the highest bidder. That all ends. But you can still own a slave, and you can still bring slaves to the nation's capital. The thing that the North hated the most and the South liked the most was this powerful fugitive slave law. So a runaway slave was called a fugitive slave, and these laws allowed for kind of posses or deputies to go pursue runaway slaves in the North. And you had thousands of runaway slaves living in places like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City, and they had been there some of them had been there for decades, 20 years. Now all of a sudden their life is very much uncertain because they could be arrested by a marshal and brought back to the South and put back to work for their owner. So this powerful fugitive slave law was passed. We see a change in the Underground Railroad because of the fugitive slave law. Conductors on the Underground Railroad now, instead of dropping off their passengers, the runaway slaves in Philadelphia or Boston or other places, now are starting to escort more of them all the way to Canada, because once they were in Canada, they were untouchable. They could live free for the rest of their life. And then again, touching on the issue of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is simply letting the people decide. So it's putting it up to a vote. And so what popular sovereignty was saying was that any of these Mexican lands, the lands that were taken from Mexico, they would be open to slavery. But at the time of when they were ready for statehood, they had to decide once and for all if they were going to be a slave state or a free state. Okay, and here we see a picture of Millard Fillmore. Looks nice there in his fine clothes, sitting in a chair, looking pretty regal. As Stephen A. Douglas is able to get parts of the bill, the Compromise of 1850 passed, he signs them. So Taylor's death kind of helped make compromise a little bit more possible. There are some important results that we should go over again. The South and the North, both sides are not happy with the compromise, but they can kind of live with the compromise. Both sides have things that they really dislike or hate in the compromise. For the North, it was the fugitive slave law. They did not like this, and there was a lot of breaking of this law in the North. The South was angered by that, and pretty soon the South could see that their opinion was that in making this compromise, maybe they gave up too much. The really important thing, though, and this is the critical thing about the Compromise of 1850, is that it cools the tempers in both the North and the South for another 10 years. So we don't have saber rattling, we don't have threats to go to war, and that's a pretty important thing for our country, because it gives the North another 10 years for its population to grow that much bigger than the South. It gives manufacturing another 10 years to grow in the North, and manufacturing was much bigger in the North than the South. And it gives the North the economy, like the banking system, another 10 years to grow too. So all these things, banking, manufacturing, population, they're going to have a big impact in 1861 when war finally does come to the country. So watch this video again as many times as it takes to get down how this Compromise of 1850 was passed.